Hey Grace Church, my name is Josh. Welcome to the weekly for the week of May 1st. Today we're talking about Jesus calming the storm. So we looked at Mark chapter 4, verse 35 through 41. Jesus has been teaching, he's been healing, he is tired. Him and the disciples get on a boat, they head to the other side, and while they are on the Sea of Galilee, a massive storm takes on, throwing water into their boat. It's possibly capsizing the vessel. And so we took just a moment to look back at what it was like to be on the Sea of Galilee in a boat back then. Then we looked at some biblical interpretation principles, and then we landed on how we apply this story to our lives. So the first part, what was it like to be on the Sea of Galilee in that time period? So boats were about 27 foot long. They had about a 4-foot hull. The Sea of Galilee is in a valley, and so very quickly storms and windstorms could come and the waves could get pretty big. I actually showed you a video of the Sea of Galilee in modern times. And we asked the question, if Jesus is asleep in the storm and he wakes up and calms the storm and calms their fear, what do we do with this story? How do we apply it to our lives, and what does this tell us about God and about ourselves? So in the middle of the story, I took a moment it's almost like a TV commercial, and I said, hey, before we talk through this story, let's take a second to say, how do we interpret the Bible? Because there's a lot of ways that we see this story done poorly and misinterpreted, so we took just a minute to say, hey, quick commercial, here's how you interpret the Bible. So learning how to read the Bible is one of the most important things in the world that you can learn, that you can teach. And there's different genres in the Bible. There's wisdom literature, Psalms, prophecy. Even in the New Testament, there's Gospels, there's the Acts of the Apostles, the epistles, and apocalyptic literature. So the way you read Mark is different than the way you read Romans. So that's where we started. And there's two words that you'll hear in biblical interpretation that you have to understand. The first word is exegesis, and that is reaching back into history to find the original author's intent to his original audience. So you ask the question, what's the context? What's the content based on the context? And the classic illustration is if somebody went back to your old yearbook and pulled out some 2-sentence quote from a letter you wrote to someone in a yearbook and then tried to hold that against you, very quickly you'd say, wait, let me tell you what was going on in that time period. Let me tell you who that was written to. Let me tell you what I meant by that. And you would almost panic if you read that out of context. So we have to apply that same principle to the Bible. That's called exegesis, what it meant in their day. The second part is called hermeneutics, and that's how we interpret it into our day. So exegesis, what it meant in their day, hermeneutics, how we apply it in our day. And then really quickly, this is a 4-step journey when you're reading the Bible. So step 1, what did it mean to its original audience? We're trying to figure out. Step 2, what's the difference between the original audience and us? Step 3, what's the principle that I can gain from this text, the timeless truth that this text is telling? And then step 4, how do I apply that principle to my life today? So a text cannot mean to us what it did not mean to them. The biblical text that we're looking at was originally intended for the people it was first written to, and then we have to take that meaning and apply it to our lives. But Grace Church, be careful what you bring to the Bible from yourself. Be careful what you read into the Bible for yourself, because remember that this story was written to a group of people meeting in the catacombs under persecution, experiencing the weight of suffering for their belief in Jesus, and that's what the original audience. So how would they have heard the story of Jesus calming the storm? What would it have been like for them? So go with me, back to the story, commercial over. Based on our journey of biblical interpretation, I want us to remember something. This group would have heard the story differently. So when they hear that someone's in a boat and there's a storm, they likely would have thought back to the story in the Old Testament of Jonah, where Jonah's in a boat and there's a storm. So there's a link to Jonah in the first century. Secondly, Jesus is sleeping, so there's a link to his humanity, that he's a human. And then thirdly, he calms the storm. There's a link to divinity. So here's what the biblical principle would have been for the original audience, that just as the waves and the wind are calmed by the Creator in Jonah chapter 1, so the winds and waves are calmed by Jesus in Mark chapter 4. That Jesus has the authority of the Creator over the natural world. That Jesus has power over the natural world. And this elicits fear and awe and wonder in the disciples, just as it elicited fear and awe and wonder in the people in the boat in the story of Jonah. And so what we said is that based on that truth, that we cannot in good faith tell you that this story was intended for you to then make it into a metaphor that says every storm in your life Jesus is going to heal or calm. We could not in good faith tell you that you're experiencing a storm in your life and you need to go wake up Jesus and he'll fix the storm. We cannot in good faith say that everything you're going through is metaphorically a storm, and the only way to get peace is for Jesus to stand up and speak to that. That's not really what's happening here in this story. What's really happening in this story is you are confronted with one who is capable of speaking to the winds and the waves and making them be quiet. And that strikes fear and awe in you. And so in this text, you have a mega storm followed by a mega peace followed by a mega fear. And so for us, you go, what does that mean for us? It's the question that maybe you're not going to like this, but the question is, do you have a proper fear of God? If Jesus walked into our church or walked into your house and we got to see him display that same kind of power, there would be fear. But recognizing that when the Bible talks about fearing God, it's not some mean, vindictive kind of thing. It's actually a beautiful invitation for us to walk. It's not, when the scripture says fear God, it's not an angry command. It's a loving invitation. Because if you fear God, then you have nothing to fear. That's what's happening. So yeah, there's storms in our lives. But we have access to one who we know his power. And so we can overcome our fear in life because our fear is placed in the right thing. Our reverence is placed in the right thing. Our awe is placed in the right thing. So our fear looks like this. I'm fearful that I don't grieve God with my lack of faith. I'm fearful that I don't live in such a way that would separate myself from God. I'm trembling at the thought of not being under the covering of Jesus. This is like how my kids fear the street because I've told them that it's dangerous, which makes them be near to me when they're at the street. My kids fear the waves at the ocean, which makes them be near to me. And that's the connection that fear draws us near to God. And so how do we practice this? We stay close to Jesus. We remain in him. We're near to him. And yes, when the storms of life come, we don't fear those storms because we have faith in the one who is worthy of a greater fear. And then I encourage you as a church to take the next part of the story and to take these biblical principles and try to apply them to when Jesus heals the demoniac and shows that he has power over the supernatural world as well. So as a Connect group, why don't you guys talk about these biblical principles? Have you thought about that before? What are some ways that you read yourself into the Bible? Secondly, what do you think the biblical principle is from this story? Where do you feel like you can apply this principle to your life? And then lastly, what is God saying in the story of Jesus calming the storm? And what is it that you're going to do about what he's saying? Well, thank you, Grace Church, for tuning in to the weekly. We hope to see you next week at church. See you then.